Welcome to this introduction to early public school football codes. The narrative can be paused, moved back, or moved forward as you wish. There were 7 major boarding schools in England in 1800, 5 in the south and 2 in the Midlands. Life in the classroom was strictly regimented, but once lessons were over, the boys ran free. Boating and cricket were popular summer recreations, but there was no football in the winter. It was frowned upon as a game for the lower social orders. So the boys ran with packs of hounds, rode with the hunts, went birds nesting, or sloped off to the taverns, or worse, in neighbouring villages. The headmasters were happy to be rid of them. Samuel Butler at Shrewsbury was typical. He hated football, and he did his best to ensure that his boys could not play the game, even well away from the school. An assistant master was detailed to hunt out the culprits. The tough regime at Shrewsbury is summed up in the words in the bottom right-hand corner, a play on the headmaster's initials. His successor, Benjamin Kennedy, represents the new brooms of the second quarter of the 19th century. The new moral code of the Church of England demanded that public schoolboys should be well-behaved gentlemen outside the classroom, and so they had to remain within the school grounds. Regular roll calls, or call-overs, made sure that they did. Kennedy positively encouraged the boys to play games. Cricket they already knew, and most would have met football at home, so they brought it to school. The game of fives, played with gloved hands and a small hard ball, was invented at this time as a game for twos and fours to play. The boys decided the rules and, in these early years, their masters took no part in the game's organisation. Perhaps the senior boys formed a committee, as they did at rugby at Uppingham. The rugby boys named it the levee. It met on a mound, called the island, on the edge of their playing area. Rules were passed on from generation to generation by word of mouth. These rules evolved as each generation sought to make improvements. The first requirement was, of course, a pitch, and what variety there was across the schools. That for the Eton Wall game was just 5 yards wide. The soggy London clay at Harrow made play very hard going. Dodging wandering bishops was a necessary skill in Westminster's cloister game, whereas rugbyians had acres of levelled fields. Winchester is set in watery meadows, and so the boys played their football on top of a local hill. The pitch was long and very narrow to reduce the chances of the ball rolling away. Lines of young boys acted as fielders. Charterhouse played in a corridor. Jumping out of one window and then through another one was a means of getting ahead of the play. Here we see boys watching a game. Uppingham chose a barrel-shaped pitch so that play was funneled towards the goals. No fancy wing play here. Bradfield used sheep hurdles to mark the side of the pitch and to stop the ball rolling down to the river. Clongowes Wood, in Ireland, they played on unforgiving gravel. Don't fall over was the motto. The match book at Westminster shows that 11-a-side games were the norm in the 1850s, but earlier sides had been much, much larger. Half the school play against the other half was common, perhaps with more than 100 in the game. Christ Hospital had just one playground. 16 games of housey football might be played simultaneously, crisscrossing the asphalt, with balls and players flying in all directions. Charterhouse had an outdoor game that was played on the green just outside the football corridor. There are records of a match starting outdoors and then moving indoors. Pickup games were popular at many schools: tall versus short, north versus south, cricketers versus rowers, surnames A to L against M to Z. Masters joined in too. There was, reputedly, a most memorable contest at Uppingham: those who had been beaten by Mr. Thring versus those who had not. And the headmaster's response? If there is a rematch, all the players will be on the same side. Pickup games led to house matches, and then to tiered house matches for boys over 16 and those under 16, overs and unders. Masters were excluded from house matches. The games were far too competitive. Eventually, schools settled on sides of 20 or 15 or 11. Play as you are, that was the rule about dress in early games. Jackets would be discarded as the game became heated. Hats and caps could be used to distinguish the two teams, or coloured bands tied around the waist. Red and white at Uppingham. Boys at Christ Hospital played in their ancient costumes, tucking the tails of their coats through their belts to form a bustle. Cricket flannels and coloured shirts came next, later, as at Marlborough, to be replaced by knickerbockers. Here is the Uppingham 15 in flannels, standing in front of their rope-top goal. A decade later, and Edinburgh Academy's 20, including one with a fine beard, wear knickerbockers and football stockings. Normal footwear, boots, was worn in the early days. Later came nailed or studded soles and reinforced toe caps. The shape of the early balls depended on the shape of the pig's bladder. The balls soon burst in play, so the shape might vary during the course of a game. Leather-covered balls lasted longer. This is how Gilbert's of rugby began its rise to worldwide fame. As the rules evolved, so each school came to prefer a spherical ball or an oval one, and should it be large or small? Oval at Christ Hospital, large spherical at Harrow and Charterhouse, small spherical at Marlborough, even though it played a rugby-like code. The boys at rugby were early fans of the oval ball, as a sketch by a boy illustrates, and the text of Tom Brown's School Days reminds us. The earliest goals at Winchester were two boys standing with their legs astride. They were replaced by a line of discarded gowns. This goal became known as a worm. Uppingham, as we have already seen, had rope-top goals. So too did Sherborne. Crossbars were rejected because they might fall on players when there was a struggle in the goalmouth. Rugby chose the H goal when pack defending it made it impossible to force the ball under the crossbar. Space behind the goal left room for touching the ball down, a try, followed by a free shot at a conversion for a goal. The arch at the entry to Repton provided one goal. Stone pillars visible in the distance, known as the Pillars of Hercules, formed the other. A door in the wall made one goal for Eton's war game. A tree made the other. The ball had to be thrown to score. The slightest touch by an opponent ruled out the goal. Two doors were the goals in Charterhouse's corridor game. Curiously, both at right angles to the direction of play. You can visit that corridor today and see the doors. A master brought football from Rugby to Durham, and the school adopted the H goal. The melee was a common feature of every early game. Half the school in one team attempting to drive the ball through the goal of the other half in defence. The scrum of modern rugby is a cut-price imitation, and soccer's defensive wall just a flimsy substitute. This 1858 illustration of Charterhouse's outdoor game matches one boy's description of Uppingham School of the period, imitating the epic battles of old as they charged. Many schools called their melees scrums or scrimmages. Others chose much more colourful names. Melees were universal in early football, so too was a strict offside rule. You could not take part in the game if you were ahead of the ball. When in front, you were off your side. The rule began to be relaxed at some schools when passing the ball forward was permitted. In time, this became an important distinction between rugby and soccer. Early tactics were simple. On securing the ball, whether on the initial charge or by catching a kick from the opposition, kick it upfield as far as possible. Rush after it as a mass and drive the ball on. Players behind the ball should follow up and take over the drive when the momentum flagged. Follow up, follow up, follow up, follow up, follow up, as Harrovians sing to this day. Cheltenham and Loretto introduced passing the ball to a teammate in their games. Players at other schools felt that this was unmanly. Was it a means of avoiding being tackled? But team play eventually triumphed over individual efforts. Whether on grass, mud, asphalt, flagstones or gravel, it was a tough and rough game. Bringing a man down was relatively safe on rugby's grass, but hazardous on Christ Hospital's asphalt. Tackling high or collaring was thus the rule at the London school, and no red cards. Hacking, aiming kicks at a player's shins, whether an opponent or a teammate, was allowed at Rugby and Charterhouse, but not at Marlborough and Uppingham. There are stories of boys trying to toughen their shins as if they were conkers, and there were no shin pads. Tripping a player on the run was permitted at Marlborough and Radley, but not at Durham and Eton. Goals, whether under or over the crossbar or rope, was the norm until packed defences seriously reduced the chances of scoring. Goals in the Eton Wall game were a rarity. Touching the ball on the ground beyond the goal line allowed for an unopposed try at a goal at some schools, today's try and conversion. Touching the ball down in the defence's in-goal area conceded a scoring advantage to an attacking side, often called a rouge. This is how young Tom Brown saved the day at Rugby and found fame. Cheltenham was the first school to introduce a scoring system using points in 1844. In time, it was adopted by the Rugby Football Union. Early games lasted until a goal was scored, and that might take days. Tom Brown's first match had to continue on a second day. Even when a time limit was set, it was still often hours. Half-time changeovers made sure that no side gained an advantage due to the slope or the wind. To save time, some schools only changed ends, leaving each player on the same side of the pitch for both halves. Rugby produced the first published rule book in 1845. Eton followed 2 years later. Most schools had written rules by the 1860s. The rugby book was small enough to fit into the captain's trouser pocket, allowing consultation if there was a dispute during play. Some rule books included advice to players and, as at Winchester, recommended positions for players. The two captains managed the games in the early years, but as the play became more competitive, umpires were introduced. The name, of course, came from cricket. A stick might be raised to indicate an infringement, or a flag might be thrown. Whistles came later. Appeals to the umpire were standard in cricket, so it was natural they should be allowed in early football. Only much later were appeals regarded as ungentlemanly, at some schools at least. Handwritten match reports like this one can be viewed in the Westminster Archives. Here's Westminster versus Charterhouse, 1863. Most schools created magazines in the 1860s, and match reports and written portraits of the leading players soon came to dominate their content. It was inevitable that boys would want to test their mettle against teams at other schools. But whose rules should apply? Would the home side have right of way, or should there be agreement after negotiation? Forest versus Chigwell's, an early match, went off smoothly, for both schools played a soccer-like game. Similarly, all was well for Edinburgh versus Merchiston, using rugby-type rules. But it was a different story for Marlborough versus Clifton in 1864, even though both schools owed allegiance to rugby. Clifton allowed hacking, but not tripping. Marlborough did the opposite. The game came close to warfare. The Marlborough captain consulted his headmaster. Should the game be stopped? No, 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 replied George Bradley. They will think we are afraid of them. Win the game first. And Marlborough did. It is reported that the two teams parted on good terms, but the match was not replayed until 1891, 27 years later. Curiously, rugby only began school matches in 1896. The call for a uniform code of football was led by old boys, the former pupils of the public schools, now studying at the universities. They wanted to play together, but to which set of rules? A series of meetings to try to settle the matter was held from the mid-1840s to the mid-1860s, a 20-year period. It was a tricky business. The most productive series of meetings was in London in the autumn of 1863. For 4 meetings, the arguments over kicking and dribbling versus handling and running with the ball were finely balanced. Could a compromise code be reached? But at the 5th meeting, members of Walthamstow's Forest Club brought along 2 boys from the neighbouring Forest School, regular match opponents, and their votes won the day for soccer. Insider dealing is not new. The rugby players withdrew, and 8 years later formed their own association. At all schools, the game evolved with time. Uppingham football began as a near cousin of rugby's game, but over a 10-year period, the more violent elements were eliminated. A satirical poem, Football at R, was published in the 1864 Uppingham School magazine. Oh, well for the schoolboy bold, who will hack his best friend but in play, but woe to the fallen boy, who has his leg smashed in the fray. At Uppingham, rules were printed, colours were awarded, and umpires guided play. Old boys at the universities returned to the school to play the boys, and to try to steer the game either towards soccer or rugby, depending on their own preference. The boys resisted, probably encouraged by their headmaster. By the mid-1870s, the game was almost soccer, and a match was played against Shrewsbury, an early and famous soccer school. A 1-1 draw was the result. Then, in the 1880s, when soccer players at major North of England clubs started to be paid, boys and old boys at Uppingham wanted to play the rugby code. Suddenly, on the arrival of a new headmaster, Uppingham football died and rugby replaced it. Just these three schools still play their early code, though they also play rugby, soccer, or both. Perhaps you might like to watch one of these early codes. This is where you can learn more about the early codes at 20 schools. The book includes many sets of rules and 164 illustrations. There is also an introductory essay by Professor Tony Collins. Thank you for listening.